They came to kill each other. But on Christmas Eve, something happened that the generals ordered to be forgotten forever. The mud. It was always the mud. Not the clean earth of a farmer's field, but a thick, grey, cloying paste mixed with rain, frozen blood, and the shredded fabric of a dozen nations. This was the landscape of the Western Front in the winter of 1914. This was the grave we dug for ourselves. In the first 5 months of the Great War, the grand, sweeping cavalry charges and patriotic parades had dissolved into a static nightmare. The armies, British, French, Belgian, German, had burrowed into the ground like moles, creating a twin scar across Europe. Two endless, opposing lines of trenches. Separating them lay no man's land, a desolate stretch of torn barbed wire and craters, a few hundred yards wide, where the only thing guaranteed to flourish was death. Imagine the sound, not the cinematic sound of constant machine gun fire, but a deeper, more insidious rhythm. The monotonous drip of water from the sandbags, the faint, desperate scratching of rats in the darkness, the distant, hydraulic cough of the big guns, always present, always reminding you what you were here for. And the silence. The terrible, strained silence between assaults, a silence so taut it could snap and unleash the fury of hell. We were young men, ripped from the gentle world of books and farms and factory floors. We came here believing in glory, in God, in the sacred duty to defend a flag. But the trenches taught a different gospel. It was a gospel of lice, dysentery, fear that tasted like metal, and the profound, cold realization that the man opposite you, the enemy, was living the exact same miserable life. And then came December. The air turned brittle. The rain stopped. The mud began to freeze into sharp, unforgiving ridges. The sheer physical misery intensified, but with the cold came a strange, ethereal quiet. A stillness that was, perhaps, the breath of God. In the days leading up to Christmas, letters arrived, tiny fragments of a world they had lost. Wives wrote of children, mothers wrote of prayers, and the common thread was the hope that surely, surely the war would pause for the holy day. It was a civilian hope, a naive wish that the generals, sitting warm miles away, would grant a reprieve. But no orders came. The doctrine was clear: kill or be killed. But the men in the trenches, they were not listening to distant generals. They were listening to their own hearts. They were listening to the wind that carried the voices of their enemy. December 24th, 1914. Dusk fell over the fields of Flanders. The sky, a bruised purple, bled into the white of the first proper frost. It was deathly cold, but a strange sound began to drift across no man's land. From the German lines, the sound of carols, a deep, sonorous baritone followed by a chorus. They were singing Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night. The British soldiers, huddled in their trenches, heard it. At first there was confusion, then a tense, nervous amusement. An officer barked, ordering silence, but the melody was too pure, too haunting. It was a sound of home, a sound that had no place in this iron landscape. Then, from the British side, a response. Tentative at first, a few voices joining in the familiar English words. Silent night, holy night. The singing became a competition, a strange, beautiful duet between men who had spent weeks trying to destroy each other. And then the German line lit up. Not with the flash of a rifle, but with hundreds of tiny lights, Christmas trees set precariously on the lip of the parapet, defying the darkness. A voice, thick with a guttural, unfamiliar accent, boomed out of the dark, "Englishman! Tomorrow you no shoot, we no shoot." The response was a mixture of stunned silence and shouted warnings. But the seed was planted. The shared human memory of Christmas, of peace, was stronger than the orders of war. The morning of Christmas Day broke clear and cold. A few brave, insane souls began to emerge. A German soldier, unarmed, walked slowly up from his trench, calling out, "Happy Christmas!" in broken English. He was met by a British officer, equally hesitant, equally unarmed. What happened next was not an organized ceasefire, but a spontaneous combustion of humanity. Imagine the scene: hundreds of men clambering over the mud and barbed wire, crawling out of the protective hell they had built. They met in the middle of no man's land, where just days before, bullets had cut down anyone who dared to move. They were hesitant ghosts at first, separated by suspicion and fear. But they found common ground instantly. They traded small, impossible treasures: German black bread for British plum pudding, tins of bully beef for bottles of schnapps, cigarettes for tobacco, buttons from their uniforms, tiny, useless trophies. They were shaking hands, these men who were mandated to hate each other. They were looking into eyes that, just hours before, were sighting down a rifle. They saw not the monster of propaganda, but a scared, freezing young man, often no older than themselves, with a picture of a girl or a child tucked into his breast pocket. They spoke in a broken medley of schoolbook French and fragmented English, but mostly they communicated with gestures: a shared puff on a pipe, a rueful shrug at the frozen mud, a gesture towards the dead. For many, the first order of business was not celebration, but reverence. The bodies of the fallen, the poor souls caught in the wire, left to rot in the mud, were now gently collected. German and British soldiers, side by side, dug shallow graves. A German theological student recited the 23rd Psalm in his native tongue. A British padre offered a prayer in English. They buried their dead together, an act of profound, shared mourning that transcended the cause of the war. The war had stopped to weep. And then, the impossible. From a British trench, someone produced a football. It might have been a regulation leather ball, or perhaps a flattened ration tin, or even a bundle of rags tied up with twine. It didn't matter. The sight of it was an invocation. A game started. Not an official match, not a tactical maneuver, but a joyous, chaotic kickabout. The goals were marked by caps or tunics. The pitch was no man's land itself, lumpy, cratered, slippery with ice and frozen mud, but utterly sacred in that moment. A German private, barely 18, with a shy smile and a terrible scar on his cheek, chased the ball alongside a sturdy Scot, a veteran steel worker, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The shouting was not the sound of combat, but the ecstatic, universal cries of sport. Pass! Mine! Shoot! Imagine the irony, the sheer, breathtaking absurdity of the scene. Officers who would shoot deserters without hesitation were now chasing a ball with the enemy, tripping over the very trenches they had been ordered to defend. It was a momentary perfect anarchy, a shared memory of boyhood breaking through the thick armor of industrialized warfare. A German soldier later wrote home, "The English were extraordinarily friendly. It was the most remarkable thing I have experienced in 22 years." A British rifleman recorded in his diary, "A sort of impromptu football match started, and we played till dusk. No one wanted to start fighting again. For an afternoon, the line that divided Europe dissolved into a single, muddy, ecstatic playing field. They laughed, they sweated, they were simply men playing a game, men who shared the simple, universal pleasure of chasing a ball. The war, the Kaiser, the king, the generals, they were all forgotten. As the low sun of December 25th began its swift descent, the atmosphere changed. A weight, a terrible foreknowledge, began to settle back over no man's land. The men knew. They had looked into the eyes of the enemy and seen only themselves. They had shared a cigar, a joke, a piece of Christmas cake. They knew the name of the man who played centre forward for the Germans, or the man who had traded his cap badge for a tin of British tea. And they knew that tomorrow, or the day after, they would be ordered to kill him. The farewells were quiet, almost formal. The handshakes were tighter, perhaps because they knew they might be the last. A German officer, crisp and correct, nodded to his British counterpart, a man he had spent the afternoon discussing the real purpose of the war with. "Today, we have had peace," he might have said. "But tomorrow, you understand, the war must start again." The answer was a grim, mutual acceptance. Yes, we understand. One by one, they retreated. Back into the darkness, back across the short, desolate space that had been transformed into a field of fellowship, now reverting to its ordained status. The killing zone. They climbed back into the damp, cold clay of their trenches, and the barbed wire closed behind them like the gates of a prison. The next few days were characterized by a tense, nervous quiet. No one wanted to fire the first shot. Some small truces persisted, a promise not to shell a certain latrine or to hold fire during breakfast. But the spell was broken. The machine of war began to grind once more. The official reaction, when news of the truce filtered up the chain of command, was furious. Generals feared this spontaneous eruption of empathy more than any enemy assault. It undermined the fundamental principle of war, the absolute dehumanization of the enemy. Orders were issued, harsh and immediate. Any future fraternization would be met with court-martial and execution. And so the game ended. The memory of the laughter, the shared tobacco, the collective burial, it was swept under the mud. The men who participated were often separated, moved to different sectors of the front, scattered like dust by the iron fist of military discipline. But the story survived, whispered in the dugouts, scratched into private letters, carried like a secret flame through the 4 years of hell that followed. What does the Christmas Truce of 1914 tell us? It tells us that war is not a natural state for mankind. It is an imposition. It is a terrible, necessary tragedy perhaps, but it is not the default setting of the human heart. For one day, on a frozen shell-scarred field in Flanders, the veneer of ideology and hatred was stripped away. It was replaced by a moment of simple recognition. 2 young men, dressed in different colored cloth, separated by a line on a map, but united by the desire for peace and the simple, joyous geometry of a kicked ball. It was a failure of war and a monumental triumph of the human spirit. It was the day that enemies played together, knowing full well they would soon try to kill each other again. That is the heartbreaking truth of the story. They had found peace, played a game, shared their cigarettes, and then returned to their posts, not because they hated the men opposite them, but because they obeyed. They traded their humanity for their duty. But the beautiful truth, the healing truth, is this. For a few hours, we saw what we could be. We saw that even in the deepest pit of man's self-made hell, The smallest flicker of light, the simplest melody, the shared memory of a child's game can stop the bullets and silence the guns. It was not a prayer against the war. It was a prayer for the man next to you, for the man opposite you, for the fleeting, precious, beautiful moment when we chose to be human, before the calendar turned and the guns spoke once more. It was the most beautiful game ever played.